As a result of what has been deemed to be unacceptable and poor behaviour while streaming, selfless DPS Dafran has been suspended from playing in Season 0 and Season 1 of Contenders and Season 5 of Competitive Play. Now, most discussion surrounding this was on the particulars of his actual actions and how bad they were or how unacceptable they were and what level of punishment he should get. And that's not really what I want to talk about. Like, yes, first and foremost, since he was griefing, like he outright said he was not trying and was basically trying to lose games, and his behavior seemed to certainly corroborate as much when you consider he's a very good player. Yeah, that certainly should be punished. I actually think personally griefing should be the #1 thing that is punished along with cheating, as opposed to, for example, saying things that are mean or being rude to people, etc., as long as you're playing fine. Then there's also the fact that he was, while streaming, showing erotic art, etc. In the case of these, I can't remember what you call them now. Those something like live novel. What do you call it when it's like that visual novel? Those like Japanese ones but it's one with like an hentai element to it. Now that alone is not only stupid if you're a pro player, because obviously sponsors aren't going to like that, your team's not going to like that, but it's also going to attract unwanted attention from Twitch at a minimum. You might just get your stream banned. So let's not ignore all of that, because those topics are fairly obvious and they're the ones that everyone's discussed. I actually wanted to put Dafran in the context of his culture, because this guy is from Denmark, and that's an area where I thought I could provide some context that people won't understand if they're coming from Western European countries or they're coming from North America, and they might make assumptions that actually don't really hold up. Because I've noticed across my time in esports, there have been numerous instances of Danish people in esports who have a big name getting involved in situations that were a little bit controversial or a lot controversial or bordered on outright antisocial behavior seemingly, and yet in most of these cases I don't really know that it was actually the same way you would perceive that behavior if it was someone from the American culture behaving the same way. I mean, you could, on a very low level, okay, so just raging, just acting in a way where you're not polite towards people in public. I mean, a classic example of that would actually be the Danish mid laner Froggen, one of the best mid laners of all time in League of Legends, and he is someone where people don't know this now, but when he first started streaming in the early days, he was quite a young guy. He had an incident where someone in his stream basically was fucking around, like one of the players on his team, and so he basically just super raged at that guy, and then when a whole thread came up about it on Reddit, he actually had what was at the time one of the most downvoted comments ever on the League of Legends subreddit, where he had people, demanded like, hey, you can't behave that way, say these things, and he sort of just laid it out like, well, if someone's fucking with my practice, I don't fucking care, and I don't fucking care what you think. So something along those lines was kind of the way he phrased it. That was the gist of it, and it was super downvoted. People were like, how can you behave that way to people in public? It seemed like in a very abrasive way to behave. A really extreme example, obviously, would be Svenskeren, the jungler now of TSM, but at the time of SK Gaming, where what happened was they went to a tournament for the World Championship in League of Legends in Season 4, and before the tournament could start, the tournament was actually divided up amongst Asian countries, and one of the early ones was going to take place in Taiwan. And when they were practicing for this, he was playing solo queue, and he made his account name called Taipei Ching Chong, which obviously is kind of a reference to where people famously in some Western countries will imply that when Chinese people speak that it just sounds like ching chong or whatever to them, and that's obviously used in something of a derogatory manner, if not just to make fun of them, normally probably in private when the Chinese person isn't there. So that's a whole separate issue as to how terrible that is as racism. But the problem is, if you do that and then you play with people who, I mean, obviously Taiwanese people are not Chinese, as by the way they will go to pains to point out to you, despite what the Chinese government thinks on mainland China. But obviously they speak Mandarin, etc., and have shared cultural heritage with China, and so they're not going to appreciate that anyway. And that actually tends to also be the way that people refer to many people from a lot of those countries. So as well as that, he also then messaged someone and basically made light of his name, like, oh, do you like my name? Does it offend you? And sort of used that. Now, the context of that one was, again, it wasn't as ridiculous as it seemed on the surface. Like, first of all, I don't think he was explicitly trying to be racist. I think he thought he was just doing edgy humor. But secondly, he also did seem to be doing the whole thing of pointing out the name and referencing it to this guy who he'd been fucking with on solo queue, in just to try and tilt that guy. It was shit talk. It was a way to try and get under that guy's skin, saying whatever you can but you know about the guy. But obviously that was perceived publicly as racism, and so as a result he actually got fined, and he had to miss the first 3 games of the tournament, and that heavily cost his team. It's one of the reasons they didn't get out of the group and didn't really have a chance to, quite frankly. There's a bunch of other ones even on lesser levels, like the player Jensen, Cloud9 mid laner, formerly known as Incarnation, was really well known for like quite aggressive and antisocial flaming, raging at people, even DDoSing people later on. And then even on a very, very light level, the Deficio, who's now a caster in League of Legends, actually during the qualifier to get into LCS for the first time, it was in Season 3 when he was playing with Copenhagen Wolves, as part of a joke to reference the fact that his young mid laner Bjergsen, who couldn't yet play and therefore they had to use someone else in the qualifier, had said he thought they wouldn't make it. On stream, when he was talking to Carmack, who from ESL was actually running all the operations in Europe at the time, he just said on stream, "Fuck you, Bjergsen." You know, whereas obviously in theory in a Riot game, especially, they don't want to hear people saying profanity, swear words, whatever on stream, and that was a little bit edgy. You know, I'm sure after that they told him, "Don't do that again. Definitely don't do that in LCS." Now, what I'm getting to here is not the idea that somehow Danish people are just allowed to do and say whatever they want and all the rest of it. But the point is their culture is different. And this is something where, again, I won't claim to be any sort of expert. This is just my own observations over the years and some of the few things I've learned from reading articles about it and talking to people from there. But first of all, one of the reasons why I've noticed, okay, so in Counter-Strike Source, this was a game where Denmark was a very, very prominent country, whereas, for example, Sweden wasn't, where Sweden's obviously the original Counter-Strike country, the one that's always dominated in Counter-Strike 1.6. And yes, Denmark had a great presence in 1.6 as well, but it also had a lot of people in Source. And interestingly, the UK, which obviously famously, especially for the last sort of 10 years or so of CS 1.6, didn't have that much kind of presence, you know. In Source, it also had a lot of presence, had a lot of lands. It was a big part of the scene. And so the two communities got to interact a lot. And I actually found out from getting to know some of the people involved in those scenes and then getting to know them in CSGO, that one thing that's interesting is there's actually a shared kind of cultural humor base, I would say, between the UK and between Denmark in that sense. Because you would think of Denmark as just another of the Nordic countries. You think, oh, Denmark must probably be quite similar to Sweden and Norway, you know, and there's got to be similar. I mean, Norwegians, for example, share some languages with the Danes, and obviously Sweden. I mean, Denmark used to like be part of Sweden a long, long time ago or something, when it was just like the Nordic kingdoms or whatever. And so you would think they'd be quite similar, but actually they're very, very different. And so, for example, Sweden now especially has become incredibly PC. It's one of the most politically correct countries in the world. They go way above and beyond with their social programs, kind of enforcing almost like groupthink, etc., and having to think along these progressive lines and all that sort of nonsense, especially feminism, etc., has run wild there. Notions that you can't make any comments about any kind of immigrants, otherwise you're racist, you know. So they've gone very heavily into a repressive aspect of culture and society, and keeping a lot of humour that otherwise might be deemed unacceptable or wrong think out of their culture. But actually Denmark really hasn't. And so, same as in the UK, we have an undercurrent. Yes, they're very popular comedians. Some of them are just like American comedians. You know, it's very simple humor. It's just playing to the crowd. It's just about things in everyday life. But there has always been a dark undercurrent of humor in the UK, where we have shows like the League of Gentlemen that are quite disturbing. You know, we have shows that always have some weird element in them. Like, well, we have stuff like the Chris Morris stuff, which is always, that's got a bit of darkness to it too, and it's got a very kind of sarcastic nature to it, a very caustic wit to it. And so for people who are Americans, they might watch this and think, what the fuck is this? Like, is this is considered funny? This is entertainment? This is humor to people? But it is. That's just part of the culture. And there is that kind of gallows humor element to everyday life, because people have an apathetic nature towards government, towards life, towards what's going on. They don't have the same kind of blind optimism as certain other cultures and countries do. And part of that means being able to make fun of anything and anyone. Now, I've noticed Denmark seems to share that a lot more than all those other Nordic countries. And they have a long history of humor, which can be very dark. Of humor, which, I mean, they have a lot of stuff that you describe as, it's called tragicomedies. It's like, it's aspects of slice of life type stuff where it could just be like, Jesus, how Dickensian, what a terrible life this guy's got. But it actually, it's supposed to be comedy. You're supposed to be able to laugh along with it. You're supposed to go, man, yeah, that is rough. Fuck, that's dark, you know. And so you see a lot of stuff in Danish culture that's been like that. I mean, an obvious example would be one of my favorite directors, Lars von Trier. who, when he famously, I think it was when he was doing the movie Antichrist, when he was at Cannes one year, he actually made a joke saying, oh, I'm a Nazi, you know, and he thought that was like a funny, flippant comment, because to him, well, obviously I'm not a Nazi, am I? And obviously I'm just making a stupid comment about something in terms, I think it was like in terms of aesthetics or something, you know. But obviously people who heard that were like, oh, you can't say that, oh my God, how can you even invoke the Nazis, and what are you doing with that association, and what's he trying to mean? And people went completely nuts because they didn't understand the cultural context in which he thought that was just an edgy joke, you know. I mean, a very obvious example would be when there was those Danish cartoons, which actually tragically, thanks to some horrifically twisted people, ended up, first of all, being dispensed, and then fakes them dispensed around the Middle Eastern world, and then some of the people involved in making those cartoons being murdered. So that was obviously a horrific example, but the point is, within Denmark, you were allowed to make these cartoons that made fun of someone's religion, or were derogatory about someone, or, I mean, those weren't exactly the most intellectual cartoons, but, you know, we understand the premise that they're not only allowed, but it's accepted in culture. Now, not everyone likes it, definitely not all Danish people like this. We're talking about a small subsection, small cross-section over a niche area of it. Now, the point I want to make on a wider sense here, by the way, none of this is to somehow justify what Dafran did or say he shouldn't be banned. As I said at the outset, on both those grounds, he probably should have had his Twitch stream banned. And yeah, almost certainly for griefing should have received some sort of suspension, fine, punishment, possibly ban. But what I'll say is, as we continue going on in esports, I do think an important aspect of how we look at what people do is you have to look at what their intention is and what their understanding of their situation is. And so as a result, no, not all crimes are equal. You don't actually just look at a crime and go, right, well, someone's dead in case A and someone's dead in case B, so let's just go ahead and say murder for both and give both people 40 to life, because we find out, oh, wait a second, in person A, yeah, the person's still dead, they were still killed. Oh, but they were murdered, right? And they were murdered in cold blood with intent and planning and also in a horrific manner. Oh, well, he's getting 40 to life. Oh, but the other person was hit by a car in a rainy scenario where the person ran out in the street. Oh, that's manslaughter, he doesn't get the same. So again, we have to know what the person thought themselves, what the intention was, and what the background is, what is the context to this situation. So I always want people to think, especially in games that have imports, or that the governing body of the game runs on the basis of American culture, that the rules and the operating parameters might be understood by people from that culture, but they won't always be otherwise. Now, this is a very extreme example because Dafran clearly fucked up no matter what context we're talking about here, but there will be other cases, especially in the case of jokes. Like, that's where I really want to push this angle, is that people are very naive in as much as once they learn something, they tend to always treat it as though, oh, it's simple. Well, when you know that, who doesn't know that? Everyone knows it. In fact, it's just easy. I just know it, you know. So particularly cultural stuff, because you learn so much of it as a child, and humans in particular learn by reference. Like, you look as your father reacts to something that your mother says, and on some kind of subconscious level, you're picking up cues and understanding like aspects of the relationship just by how he responds and what his expression is, and then what he says next. And a lot of this stuff's being calculated by your brain to put out a model of what your world is like and what the rules are and what the hard rules are and what the guidelines are and where the wiggle room is. And you're learning all this stuff, you're taking it on, and your culture becomes your operating system. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people don't think they have an operating system. They think they're just in the world and they're just a person and that these are all their morals, etc. No, this is the cultural operating system they exist within, and they know what commands to say at different points in the game, almost like one of those like RPGs where you walk around, you know, and then when you talk to the person, you have the options of what to say, and that provokes the different game actions and the different kind of paths you can go down, the different branches to the tree of the story, you know. So just as you had to be inculcated in that and had to learn it by reference, by being taught it by rote, by being punished at times, you have to remember some of these reasons why you have to have this process is it's not obvious. It is arbitrary in some senses. I mean, we know in some cultures, in some Middle Eastern cultures, it's fine to cut your hand off if you steal something. You'd be like, what the fuck? That's totally upset. Well, vice versa. You can go and say something in a certain sense, but it's absolutely fine in some countries. It's terrible in other ones. We know that these things exist. So whenever we're looking at these people, we got to understand the cultural context that they come from. And so while I certainly wouldn't excuse any of the behavior that Dafran did in that sense, I do think some of the joking and some of the things he thought was fine and some of the almost absurd behavior, I don't actually think it was intended as maliciously or as purposely antisocial as it would be if someone who grew up in upstate New York did it and understood all this cultural context and maybe even knew more about esports and knew how a company like Twitch would respond, how Blizzard would respond, how his team would respond. And so whenever we're talking about imports, because in the future it's going to happen with like Koreans and Chinese people, etc., we've always got to understand the cultural context. 'Cause I can tell you right now, if the number one game in the world, the esports scene, was all in Korea, and the best Western players were actually better than the Koreans, and they could get imported to Korea, they'd be running into a lot of problems, that some of them much worse than this, and for much, much lighter, much less excessive things. They could say things on a very low level to their coach, oh, come on, man, it wasn't my fault that went wrong, and they'd be considered insubordinate, and they'd have broken their curfew if they came in half an hour late. What do you mean? I was caught in the train or something, you know. There'd be all these aspects, and then more other things where their culture's repressive in other different areas. And so I thought it was an interesting piece of context to put out there, because again, I'm not claiming to be an expert on Danish culture, but this is an example of where you got to kind of see where someone's coming from to then figure out how egregious what they've done or said is.
Hey, this is Huck. If you want to watch this top 3 asshole keep doing esports content, subscribe to Thorin's YouTube channel.